Dawn broke over the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944, with the horizon stained a dull copper from the rising sun. The humid air shimmered above steel flight decks, and on the American carriers of Task Force 58, crews scrambled across decks slick with oil and salt. Radios crackled with clipped commands. Aviation fuel burned sharp in the throat, and propellers shrieked as engines roared to life. It was 10:30 a.m. when the first Japanese formations appeared as dark specks against the sun, dozens swelling into hundreds. They came in waves, fighters, bombers, torpedo planes, driven by a doctrine of audacity, expecting to overwhelm through numbers and zeal. Yet within minutes, Japanese pilots faced a nightmare that defied their training. Their Zeros, once kings of the Pacific, were shredded in mid-air, falling in flaming spirals. By dusk, over 400 Japanese aircraft lay scattered across the sea and islands, a massacre that would earn its name, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. U.S. Navy log, June 19, 1944. To grasp why this day unfolded with such brutality, one must step back into the heart of 1944. The Pacific War had entered its decisive phase. After 2 years of island hopping, the United States now stood at Japan's inner defensive ring. The Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were not just coral outposts. They were the gateways to the Japanese home islands, within range of the new B-29 superfortresses. If seized, they would give the U.S. the ability to strike Tokyo directly. Japanese planners, fully aware of this existential threat, committed their entire remaining carrier strength, 9 carriers, nearly 450 planes, and over 500 land-based aircraft. Japanese combined fleet orders, June 1944. Yet the force that steamed into battle that June morning was not the same Imperial Navy that had stunned Pearl Harbor or swept the Indian Ocean. Attrition had been merciless. The veterans of 1941 were gone. Their replacements younger, less trained, often rushed from flight schools that could no longer provide the long apprenticeship Japanese doctrine demanded. Against them stood the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet, under Admiral Raymond Spruance and Task Force 58, commanded by Admiral Mark Mitcher, 15 carriers, more than 900 aircraft, and a cadre of battle-hardened aviators who had learned the Zero's every weakness through years of bitter trial. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey 1946. The Japanese plan, codenamed Operation Ago, was daring but brittle. Their carriers would lure the American fleet westward, while land-based planes from Guam and Rota struck from shore. They expected American losses to be crippling, forcing a withdrawal. The Imperial General Staff believed in the mystical superiority of the Zero and the courage of its pilots. They could not yet grasp that the technological tide had shifted irrevocably. Imperial Navy Operations Memo, May 1944. As the first Japanese waves roared in, the Hellcat squadrons were already airborne. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, heavier and less nimble than the Zero in theory, proved devastating in practice. With 2,000 horsepower engines, thicker armor, 650 caliber Browning machine guns, and dive speeds the fragile Zero could not match, the Hellcats tore into the attackers. Pilots described the sky as a shooting gallery, as Zero after Zero disintegrated in bursts of tracers. Pilot debrief VF-15, June 1944. On the carriers below, radar operators tracked approaching raids feeding precise vectors to combat air patrols. This unseen electronic curtain meant the Japanese never achieved surprise. Instead, they flew headlong into ambushes guided by blips on American screens. Bureau of Ships Report 1943. By early afternoon, wave after wave had been broken. The Japanese lost nearly 70% of their attacking force in a single day. One American pilot, Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, would down 7 aircraft in a single sortie. U.S. Navy pilot record, June 1944. In contrast, U.S. losses were minuscule, just a few dozen planes, many of them to fuel exhaustion rather than enemy fire. Survivors among Japanese aviators returned to carriers only to find their decks already under pressure. With precious few planes left to launch, Japanese carriers became floating targets, waiting for the next phase of American strikes. But the drama was not merely numerical. For the Japanese pilots in their cockpits, it was a psychological shock. Many had been raised on stories of the Zero's invincibility, of dogfights where courage outweighed machinery. That morning, they discovered the myth had shattered. Ammunition ripped through aluminum skin like tissue. Attempts at sharp turns failed against faster diving Hellcats. One dramatized composite diary described the sky as a black wall of bullets, from which no path to glory could be found. Bundesarchiv, Pilot Diary. The battle also revealed the deeper contrasts in doctrine. Japanese naval aviation had prized individual skill and aggression. The United States, however, had shifted towards systems warfare. Integrated radar networks, disciplined formations, carrier task groups that functioned like a single organism. Where Japan sought the decisive strike, the Americans relied on attrition, logistics, and relentless replacement. Each shot-down Hellcat could be replaced within weeks by factories at Grumman's Bethpage plant. Each lost zero represented years of pilot training Japan could no longer afford. War Production Board Report, 1944. The Marianas Battle marked not only the crumbling of Japan's air arm, but also the end of its carrier supremacy. Within 48 hours, the Imperial Navy's attempt to reverse the tide had collapsed. Yet in the chaos of that day, Japanese commanders still believed reinforcements or sheer will might turn the tide. Orders crackled over radios demanding renewed attacks. By dusk, however, decks were empty, and the once proud air groups had vanished into smoke and foam. Imperial Navy Signal Log, June 1944. As the sun set, Mitchell made a daring decision. Though American pilots were low on fuel and darkness threatened disaster, he ordered, "Turn on the lights," illuminating carrier decks like beacons in the night. Dozens of returning Hellcats limped back, some ditching in the Black Sea, others crashing in fiery landings. But the gesture symbolized what the day had proven. American naval aviation had become an unbreakable machine, both human and industrial, that Japan could no longer match. Admiral Mitchell order, June 19, 1944. Yet the massacre of aircraft was only the prelude. The true secret behind the Hellcats' dominance, the hidden web of radar, manufacturing, training pipelines, and tactical doctrine, remained largely invisible to Japanese observers that day. They saw only the smoke trails of their fallen comrades. They did not yet understand why the Zero supremacy had evaporated so suddenly, or how America had turned the Pacific into a proving ground of industrialized warfare. The answer lay deeper, in factories, laboratories, and the minds of engineers whose work stretched from Long Island assembly lines to carrier decks thousands of miles away. And it was that hidden edge, still obscured from the Japanese high command, that would be revealed in the days that followed, turning the skies of the Pacific into a graveyard for the Empire's last hope. On the morning after the slaughter over the Philippine Sea, Japanese commanders tried to tally their losses. What they discovered was staggering. Hundreds of planes gone, irreplaceable crews wiped out, and the very core of their doctrine shattered. Yet few understood why the disaster had unfolded with such completeness. The truth lay not only in brave pilots or tactical mistakes, but in the hidden machinery of American advantage, an advantage forged by engineers, scientists, and factory workers long before the battle began. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey 1946. The centerpiece of this hidden edge was the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. Designed by Leroy Grumman and his engineering team on Long Island, the Hellcat was built not as a sleek dueling champion, but as a rugged killer. It weighed nearly 2,500 pounds when loaded, nearly double that of the Japanese Zero. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine churned out 2,000 horsepower, propelling the fighter to speeds of 376 miles per hour. Armor plating shielded the cockpit, self-sealing fuel tanks resisted fire, and 650 caliber M2 Browning machine guns spat a devastating 450 rounds per gun. Technical Manual TM 9-294, 1943. Against the lightly built Zero, whose armor was virtually non-existent and whose fuel tanks ignited at the first spark, the Hellcat was a butcher's blade. Even more decisive was the unseen realm of electronics. American carriers by 1944 bristled with radar arrays. The SK long-range search radar, the SC and SG sets, capable of detecting aircraft at over 100 miles. These radars, produced by companies like RCA and General Electric, gave Task Force 58 early warning. Radar operators could plot incoming raids, feed precise bearings to fighter directors, and launch Hellcats to intercept before Japanese formations ever saw their targets. It was a revolution in naval warfare. The sky itself had been mapped, invisible lines of radio pulses turning chaos into geometry. Bureau of Ships Report, 1943. The Japanese had no comparable system. Their reliance on visual spotting meant American fighters always had the first strike. Pilots later recalled diving into bomber formations that seemed bewildered, as if they had no idea ambush awaited them. One dramatized composite Japanese pilot noted in debrief, "We were already surrounded before we knew the enemy was there." Captured pilot interrogation, 1944. Beneath the electronics and engines lay an industrial engine unmatched in history. Grumman's Bethpage plant rolled out Hellcats at a furious pace, with assembly lines optimized by engineers like William Schwendler, ensuring modular construction and simplified maintenance. Between 1943 and 1945, more than 12,000 Hellcats were built, an average of nearly 400 per month. War Production Board Report, 1944. Spare parts, standardized components, and reliable logistics meant that every lost fighter could be replaced within weeks, while Japanese factories struggled to produce even a fraction of their pre-war output under the strain of bombing and material shortages. The impact of this hidden advantage came to a head during the Battle of the Philippine Sea's second day, June 20, 1944. By then, the Japanese carrier force was crippled but not destroyed. Admiral Raymond Spruance, cautious by nature, hesitated to pursue the fleeing enemy. His subordinate, Admiral Mark Mitchell, pressed for a strike. Late that afternoon, Mitchell launched the most ambitious carrier raid of the war. U.S. Navy Action Report, June 20, 1944. From 15 carriers, 240 planes roared into the sky, Hellcats, Avengers, and Dauntlesses. They flew west over 200 miles into the sinking light of the setting sun. For pilots, fuel gauges danced perilously low, but the opportunity to annihilate the enemy outweighed the risk. Pilot account VF-15, 1944. They found their quarry off the coast of the Marianas, the remnants of Japan's carrier fleet, Zuikaku, Shokaku, Hiyo, and others. By now these ships were shadows of their former power, their decks nearly barren of aircraft. Yet they were still dangerous, bristling with anti-aircraft guns. Hellcats swept ahead, tearing into the few defending Zeros. With radar guidance, they intercepted the defenders at precise altitude and bearing, breaking the screen before bombers moved in. After action report, USS Lexington, 1944. Dive bombers and torpedo planes followed, streaking down through flak. The carrier Hiyo was struck by multiple bombs and torpedoes. Flames consumed her hangar, and she sank beneath the waves that evening. Shokaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor, took 3 torpedoes from USS Cavala's submarine, erupting in fireballs that shattered her into the sea. U.S. Submarine Patrol Report, June 1944. The once mighty Kido Butai, the Japanese carrier strike force that had terrorized the Pacific, was annihilated in a single sunset. As dusk deepened, American pilots faced their own crisis. Low on fuel and hundreds of miles from their carriers, many knew they would not make it home. Mitchell gave an order unprecedented in naval history. Turn on the lights. On every American carrier, searchlights flared, deck lights blazed, even cigarettes glowed on deck. The risk of submarine attack was ignored. The lives of aviators mattered more. Hellcats limped back, some ditching in the black waters, others belly flopping onto decks. Nearly 80 planes were lost that night to fuel exhaustion and crashes, but the fleet survived, its carriers intact, its air arms supreme. Admiral Mitchell order, June 20, 1944. For Japanese survivors, the battle was apocalyptic. Pilots who returned found their decks shattered, their comrades gone. One dramatized composite officer described the scene. Our proud ships floated helpless, like skeletons in the moonlight. Captured Officer Testimony, 1944. For the first time, the Imperial Navy understood that its carriers were no longer offensive weapons. They were liabilities. Without trained pilots, without planes, they were hulks destined for destruction. The technical edge had not been accidental. It was the product of foresight. American engineers had studied the Zero after one crash landed in the Aleutians in 1942. They identified its weaknesses: poor dive speed, no armor, fragile fuel system. Grumman designed the Hellcat to exploit these flaws deliberately, while radar scientists at MIT's radiation laboratory refined detection systems that would integrate seamlessly with fleet tactics. MIT RadLab Report 1943. Every factory worker tightening a bolt in Bethpage, every technician calibrating a radar on a carrier deck was part of this hidden army. Their work had traveled invisibly from blueprint to battlefield, tipping the scales on that June day. By the battle's end, Japan had lost 3 carriers, over 400 aircraft, and nearly all of its remaining veteran pilots. The United States lost just 123 planes, most to fuel rather than combat. The kill ratio was staggering. For every American loss, nearly 10 Japanese aircraft fell. U.S. Navy Loss Report, June 1944. Never again would Japan mount a major carrier offensive. The scale of this collapse reverberated far beyond the Marianas. On Japanese radios, desperate calls went unanswered. Commanders ashore could not fathom how so many planes had vanished so quickly. The truth was simple yet devastating. American technology, industry, and doctrine had converged into a system of war that no amount of bravery could overcome. As the fires of the Philippine Sea burned into the night, the last illusions of Japanese naval aviation went with them. Yet for the Americans, the victory raised a larger question. If the enemy could be dismantled so completely in the air, what did it mean for the final stages of the Pacific War? Would technology alone bring Japan to its knees, or would even greater sacrifices be required before the empire fell? The ocean was calm on the morning of June 21, 1944, but for the Imperial Japanese Navy, the silence was suffocating. The once proud Kido Butai, architects of Pearl Harbor, now drifted in tatters. 3 carriers lay beneath the Philippine Sea. Hundreds of planes had been reduced to burning fragments, and the very spirit of Japanese naval aviation was broken. It was not simply a battlefield defeat. It was the death of an idea, that courage and precision could triumph over industry and science. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. Strategically, the collapse of Japan's air arm was immediate and irreversible. Admiral Spruance's Fifth Fleet pressed forward, secure in the knowledge that carrier aviation, the hammer of Japanese naval doctrine, had been blunted. Within days, U.S. Marines stormed ashore on Saipan. For the Japanese High Command, the loss of Saipan was catastrophic. It placed the home islands within striking range of the new B-29 superfortresses, strategic bombers capable of carrying 10 tons of explosives across 1,500 miles. With the Marianas secured, Tokyo itself became a target for systematic destruction. Army Air Forces Planning Report 1944. For the men on the ground and sea, however, the implications were more human than strategic. Survivors of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot spoke of the eerie emptiness on Japanese decks. Silent flight crews, officers pacing without orders to give, engines silent in hangars. One dramatized composite American pilot recalled circling over the battlefield and seeing oil slicks stretching to the horizon, dotted with lifeboats, each one carrying men who had once sworn never to surrender. Pilot debrief. For F-16, June 1944. The battle revealed a psychological fracture. Japan's doctrine of spiritual victory, the belief that willpower could overcome material inferiority, collapsed when confronted with radar-guided interceptions, indestructible Hellcats, and replacement squadrons flowing endlessly from American factories. American morale, by contrast, soared. Newspapers back home hailed the Turkey Shoot as proof that Japan's power had peaked. Families of aviators clipped articles, marveling at kill ratios that seemed impossible. But behind the headlines lay a sobering truth. Victory had been purchased not only with courage, but with the sweat of workers and the minds of engineers. At Grumman's Bethpage plant, riveters and machinists followed the news, aware that their long nights on the assembly line had translated into survival for boys their own age thousands of miles away. War Production Board Report 1944. Radar technicians aboard carriers, often overlooked in wartime glory, knew that their blips and bearings had saved lives by turning the vast Pacific into a map under their command. Japanese post-war interrogations revealed the depth of despair. Captured pilots admitted they had entered the battle believing in the Zero's superiority, only to be shocked by the Hellcats' resilience. One dramatized composite testimony described firing into an American fighter and watching bullets spark harmlessly off its body, like rain on stone. Japanese pilot interrogation, 1945. Such impressions revealed a profound psychological imbalance. The Americans trusted their machines and their system. The Japanese trusted only individual skill. In modern war, it was the system that prevailed. This victory also reshaped naval doctrine for generations. The Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated that radar coordination, mass production, and integrated logistics could outweigh numerical parity or even tactical daring. In the Cold War decades that followed, U.S. doctrine evolved into network-centric warfare, where sensors, communications, and firepower fused into seamless operations. The lessons of June 1944 echoed through Korea, Vietnam, and into the Gulf War, where technology once again magnified American strength. Department of Defense Analysis, 1991. But perhaps the most poignant legacy lay in the recognition of sacrifice. While Japanese carriers burned, dozens of American aviators ditched into the sea that June night, running out of fuel after Mitch's turn-on-the-lights order. Rescue operations stretched into dawn, with destroyers plucking survivors from shark-infested waters. For their families, the battle was remembered not as a clean victory but as a night of fear, waiting for news of sons and brothers who had vanished over black waves. U.S. Navy Search and Rescue Report, 1944. On the Japanese side, the human cost was even greater. The aviators lost in the Philippine Sea represented the last generation of men who had trained under the old system, veterans with irreplaceable experience. Their deaths left behind an air arm manned by novices, unready for the crucible of Leyte Gulf or the kamikaze campaigns that would follow. In effect, the battle decapitated Japanese naval aviation in a single blow. Imperial Navy Personnel Records, 1944. Psychologically, the defeat marked the beginning of a darker phase of the war. With conventional hope extinguished, Japan turned increasingly to desperation, suicide tactics, kamikaze strikes, and the rhetoric of annihilation. The Philippine Sea was thus not only a tactical turning point, but a cultural one, where a nation's confidence in mastery of the skies gave way to fatalism. Post-war Japanese War Ministry Memo, 1946. For the Allies, the lesson was stark but enduring. War could not be won by valor alone. It demanded the full mobilization of science, industry, and organization. Each rivet hammered into a Hellcats frame, each radar calibrated by a sailor in the belly of a carrier, had mattered as much as each burst of gunfire in the sky. The Philippine Sea was proof that modern conflict belonged not to the lone ace, but to the collective effort of millions, synchronized into a machine of war. As the years passed, veterans of Task Force 58 spoke of the battle with mixed pride and sorrow. Pride in their unassailable dominance, sorrow for the cost borne by friend and foe alike. Admiral Mitcher, reflecting on his decision to illuminate the carriers that night, later remarked that, "No order ever cost me more or saved so many." Admiral Mitcher Memoir, 47. His words captured the paradox of victory, triumph and loss intertwined, inseparable. By the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the seeds planted in the Philippine Sea had borne their final fruit. Carrier aviation was no longer a duel of pilots, but a symphony of systems. The Zero, once feared, had become a relic of another era. The Hellcat, rugged and unglamorous, had become the symbol of a war won through science, production, and persistence. In the end, the lesson of the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot extended beyond the Pacific. It was not just about planes shot down or ships sunk. It was about the essence of modern war, that no matter how fierce the warrior, it is the machine behind him, the network that sustains him, that decides the fate of nations, or as one dramatized composite pilot, years later, summarized with haunting simplicity. In 1941, the Zero ruled the skies. By 1944, the sky itself had turned against Japan, and from that day forward, the future of warfare belonged not to myth or spirit, but to those who could build, connect, and endure.